Chisomo's life in Dora Village was like living in a house full of shadows. She had married with so much hope, dreaming of laughter and children running around the family compound. But those dreams turned into painful reminders every single day. The women in the family whispered behind her back, their sharp voices cutting through her heart like knives. Her mother-in-law never missed a chance to call her empty or useless, and her sisters-in-law laughed at her quietly, as if her pain was a joke. Even the younger cousins, influenced by the elders, looked at her with pity, as though she carried a curse. Chisomo tried to smile, tried to serve her husband's family with respect, but deep down she was breaking piece by piece. Nights were the hardest. When everyone else slept, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering why God had chosen her to walk such a painful road. The man she had trusted, her own husband, stayed silent through it all, never defending her, never holding her hand. In that compound, surrounded by so many people, Chisomo had never felt more alone in her life. Do you want me to continue with part 2? The night she was cast out, 200 words? In the same emotional and viral style? That night in Dora will forever stay in Chisomo's memory. The family compound was filled with loud voices, food, and laughter, but none of it reached her heart. She sat quietly at the edge of the gathering, serving plates, pouring drinks, and pretending not to hear the whispers around her. But as the evening went on, the talk turned sharper, the questions bolder. "What use is a wife who cannot give us children?" her mother-in-law asked loudly, making sure everyone heard. Laughter rippled across the room. Chisomo's eyes filled with tears, but she forced herself to stay still. Her heart begged her husband to speak up, to defend her, but he sat with his head down, chewing slowly, as if the words had nothing to do with him. Then, in front of everyone, her mother-in-law rose to her feet. She pointed straight at Chisomo and declared, "You are useless in this family. You have brought us shame. Tonight you will leave." Gasps filled the air, but no one stood up for her. Her husband stayed silent, and that silence hurt more than all the insults. Suddenly, her bag was thrown at her feet, her clothes spilling onto the ground like discarded rags. The family compound that was supposed to be her home now treated her like a stranger. Shaking with tears streaming down her cheeks, Chisomo picked up her things. She begged her husband with her eyes one last time, but he didn't even look at her. The compound gate was opened, and she was pushed out into the cold night. The sky was dark and the wind was harsh against her skin, but the pain inside her chest was even colder. She walked away slowly, her heart breaking with every step, realizing that the people she had once called family had turned their backs on her completely. That night, Chisomo lost not only a home but also the last piece of love she thought she had. Do you want me to continue with 3? Tears on the Road, 350 words. In the same viral emotional style? The night was heavy and silent as Chisomo walked barefoot along the narrow village path. The ground was rough with stones and thorns, but she barely felt the pain in her feet because the pain in her heart was so much greater. Tears streamed down her face, blurring her vision, and every step felt like dragging the weight of 1,000 sorrows. The stars above seemed distant, uncaring, as if even heaven had turned its face away from her. She kept asking herself the same question over and over. Is this the end of my life? Is this all I was meant for, to be thrown away like nothing? Her chest ached with every breath. She thought of the nights she had prayed, the mornings she had hoped, the sacrifices she had made to be a good wife and daughter-in-law. None of it mattered now. The voices of her in-laws still rang in her ears, calling her useless, echoing louder than the crickets in the dark fields around her. For a moment she wished the ground would open up and swallow her, so she would no longer feel this crushing shame. But as she stumbled forward, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, a quiet whisper rose inside her heart. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like a small flame refusing to die in the wind. This is not the end. This is just the beginning. She didn't know where the thought came from, but it gave her strength to take another step and then another. Somewhere deep inside, she felt that her story wasn't finished, that one day the same people who pushed her out would see her differently. So with swollen eyes and bleeding feet, Chisomo kept walking through the darkness. She had nothing in her hands, but she carried something far more powerful in her spirit. A fragile, stubborn hope that refused to die. Do you want me to continue with 4? The Unexpected Helper, 350 words. In the same tone and style? The road was long and lonely, and Chisomo's legs were shaking from the weight of both her bag and her pain. Just when she thought she would collapse on the side of the dusty path, a familiar voice called her name. She turned and saw Mama Tandy, her old neighbor, an elderly woman known in Dora for her kindness. Mama Tandy's eyes immediately softened when she saw Chisomo's swollen face and trembling hands. Without asking too many questions, she rushed to her side, held her by the shoulders and said, "My child, come with me." Chisomo tried to explain through her sobs, but Mama Tandy didn't need details. She already knew what had happened. News in a village travels faster than the wind. That night, Mama Tandy gave her a warm meal and a small bed to sleep in. For the first time in weeks, Chisomo felt the comfort of a mother's embrace, something her husband's family had denied her. As she lay on the straw mat, tears still wetting her cheeks, she whispered silently, "God, please don't leave me like this." Days passed, and Mama Tandy cared for her as if she were her own daughter. She offered gentle words, reminding Chisomo that rejection was not the end, but sometimes the doorway to something greater. Sitting on the old wooden stool outside the small hut, Chisomo began to think about her life differently. Maybe being cast out wasn't her downfall. Maybe it was her chance to rise. In those quiet nights, Chisomo began to dream again. She imagined herself walking tall, dressed in beauty, with a life far better than the one she had lost. She promised herself that one day, the same people who had mocked her would bow their heads in regret. They would see her not as a broken woman, but as a woman who turned her tears into strength. That vow, whispered in the silence of Mama Tandy's hut, became the seed of the new Chisomo. Do you want me to move on with 5? A fresh start in Lamika City, 350 words. In the same emotional and viral style? Leaving Dora behind, Chisomo carried nothing but her small bag and her unbroken spirit. She arrived in Lamika City with no family, no friends, and no money in her pocket. The busy streets felt like a different world. Tall buildings, rushing cars, and strangers everywhere. It was overwhelming, but she told herself she would not return to the same people who had cast her out. She had to survive. At first, survival meant small jobs, washing clothes, cleaning houses, and selling vegetables by the roadside. Her hands cracked from soap, her feet blistered from standing long hours, but she worked without complaint. At night, she returned to the tiny room she rented, often with only a piece of bread and water for dinner. She cried sometimes, but unlike before, these tears were mixed with determination. She promised herself she would rise, even if it took years. Slowly, she saved a little money and enrolled in evening classes. She learned to read better, to write, and even study business basics. It wasn't easy. There were nights she wanted to give up, but the memory of her humiliation in Dora kept her moving forward. People began to notice her discipline, her strength, and her honesty. Employers trusted her, and neighbors admired her. With time, she managed to start a small catering service, using her skills in cooking. She worked day and night, and soon her food was in demand across Lamika. Everyone who met her spoke about her resilience and grace. The girl who had once been called useless was now building a name that carried respect. Chisomo knew she wasn't yet where she wanted to be, but she also knew she was no longer the broken woman who had been thrown out in the night. She was becoming someone new, someone strong, unshakable, and ready for the destiny waiting ahead. Do you want me to continue with 6? Love Beyond Scars, 350 words. In the same heartfelt, viral tone? Years later, when Chisomo's small business had grown strong enough to stand on its own, she was invited to a charity event in Lamika City. She dressed simply, wearing a neatly pressed African print dress she had sewn herself, and carried with her the quiet confidence of a woman who had learned to survive storms. She didn't know that night would change her life forever. Among the crowd was Kale, a billionaire businessman whose name was known across the country. But unlike most rich men, he didn't arrive with arrogance. He moved with humility, shaking hands with workers, smiling at children, and speaking to everyone with respect. When his eyes fell on Chisomo, it wasn't her dress, her business, or even her beauty that caught his attention. It was the calm strength in her eyes, the kind of strength that only comes from pain and survival. They began talking, first about the charity work, then about life. Kale listened to her story with genuine interest, never once looking at her with pity. He admired her courage, her resilience, and her refusal to let the world break her. Chisomo, on the other hand, was surprised by his humility. She had met many men who judged her past, but here was one who didn't see her as childless or rejected. He saw her as a woman of worth. Their conversations turned into friendship, and that friendship slowly grew into something deeper. Kale didn't rush her, didn't try to fix her scars, he simply loved her with them. For the first time, Chisomo felt safe, seen, and valued for who she truly was. Love, real love, had finally found her, and it was built not on fear or shame but on mutual respect and trust. Do you want me to move forward with 7? The Gift of Twins, 350 words. In the same emotional and viral style? After so many years of carrying silent tears in her heart, Chisomo finally held joy in her arms. The day she gave birth to her twin daughters felt like the heavens had opened and poured blessings over her life. The nurses placed 2 tiny, perfect babies on her chest, Amira and Ayana, and in that moment the woman once called barren felt a love so deep it healed wounds words could never reach. She cried, but these tears were different. They were tears of gratitude, of victory, of finally being seen by God. Kale stood by her side, his eyes shining with pride as he kissed her forehead and whispered, "You are the strongest woman I know." The house that had once been silent now overflowed with laughter, soft cries, and the sweet music of babies. Every corner of their home was alive with the sound her in-laws once said she would never know. At night, when the twins giggled in their sleep, Chisomo would sit beside their crib and just watch them breathe, her heart swelling with joy she could barely contain. Motherhood gave her a new glow. She dressed her daughters in matching dresses, braided their tiny curls, and sang them songs of hope. To her, Amira and Ayana were not just children. They were living proof that rejection is not the final word, that pain can be turned into promise. Every time she kissed their little cheeks, she remembered the insults, the shame, the night she was thrown out, and each time she smiled, because life had written a different ending for her. What once was her greatest sorrow had become her greatest blessing. The woman who was mocked for being childless now held double the joy, and her home echoed with the laughter that once seemed impossible. Do you want me to continue with 8? The family reunion announcement, 350 words. In the same style? The long-awaited day finally came. Ndora village buzzed with excitement as relatives from far and wide filled the family compound. Laughter, drums, and chatter echoed through the air as people exchanged greetings. Children ran barefoot, elders sat under shade trees, and women carried trays of food. Everyone was eager to see who would arrive next. Cars lined up outside the compound, each entrance followed by claps and cheers. But suddenly, the sound of engines silenced the crowd. A sleek black convoy rolled in, shining under the afternoon sun. The air shifted, and whispers rushed through the gathering. When the doors opened, all eyes turned in one direction. Chisomo stepped out, her head held high. She wore a stunning African lace gown that shimmered like royalty, her skin glowing with confidence. In her arms she carried Amira, while Ayana clung playfully to her free hand. Beside her, Kale walked with quiet pride, dressed in a tailored agbada that spoke of both elegance and power. It was a sight that no one in the compound could ignore. Gasps spread quickly. Mouths hung open. The same woman who had once been mocked and thrown out barefoot into the night now returned like a queen. Children paused mid-play. Elders leaned forward in disbelief, and her in-laws froze, unable to hide their shock. The woman they had called useless was not only a mother but also the wife of a man whose face they had seen on television, in newspapers, and on magazine covers. Chisomo didn't need to say a word. Her presence alone was louder than any insult they had ever thrown at her. The twins giggled, their laughter floating through the air, as if to mock the silence that had fallen on the compound. Kale placed his hand gently on Chisomo's back, and together they walked forward. Every step they took was like thunder in the hearts of those who once despised her. She had returned, not broken, not ashamed, but shining brighter than they could have ever imagined. Do you want me to continue? The moment Chisomo and Kale stepped into the compound, the entire place fell into an uneasy silence. The chatter that had filled the air only seconds ago disappeared as if someone had pressed pause on life itself. Faces froze, eyes widened, and jaws dropped. Relatives who had once laughed at her pain now struggled to recognize the woman before them. This was not the same broken Chisomo they had cast out years ago. This was a woman glowing with dignity, walking in power, holding in her arms the very blessing they said she would never have. Her mother-in-law's eyes darted from the twins to Kale, then back to Chisomo. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The shame was too heavy. The sisters-in-law, who once mocked her in whispers, now hid their faces, pretending to adjust their dresses. Even the men, who had joined in throwing her out, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their pride collapsing under the weight of truth. Every corner of the compound buzzed with whispers. Is that her? The same Chisomo? How did she? And who is that man? Children, too young to understand the tension, ran to look closer at the convoy, admiring the polished cars. The twins laughed and reached out their tiny hands, their joy cutting through the silence like sunlight breaking through clouds. Their innocent giggles were louder than 1,000 drums, and in that sound, every cruel word ever spoken against Chisomo was silenced. She walked gracefully, her head lifted, her step steady. She didn't need revenge, she didn't need to shout. Her very presence was enough to make them swallow their pride. The woman they once rejected had returned not in shame, but in glory, shining brighter than they could have ever imagined. Do you want me to move forward with 11? The husband's presence, 350 words. In the same emotional, viral style? As Chisomo stood in the center of the compound, Kale remained by her side, tall and calm, his presence commanding respect without a single word. At first, many of the relatives thought he was just another wealthy man. But then someone whispered his name. That's Kale the billionaire. The word spread like fire in dry grass. Eyes widened, mouths dropped, and suddenly everyone realized this was the same man they had seen on television, in glossy magazines, and in newspaper headlines. The compound that once mocked Chisomo now buzzed with hushed voices. Aunties nudged each other, uncles adjusted their caps nervously, and cousins leaned in closer just to be sure they weren't dreaming. How could this be? Chisomo, the barren woman, is married to him. Shock rippled across the family like waves, drowning their pride and leaving only shame in its place. Her mother-in-law, who once called her useless, couldn't hide the tremble in her hands as she stared at Kale. The man was everything her family admired. Wealthy, powerful, and respected across the nation. And yet, he stood proudly beside the woman they had thrown away, holding her hand as though she was the most precious jewel in the world. Kale greeted the elders politely, bowing his head slightly, his humility only deepening the sting in their hearts. He didn't flaunt his status, but his very presence reminded them of what they had lost. They had cast out Chisomo, and in doing so, they had also cast out the honor that now shone before their eyes. The once proud family members avoided her gaze, their arrogance melting into quiet shame. Chisomo didn't need to boast. The man at her side said everything her lips never had to. The woman they rejected had returned with more than just children. She had returned with honor, power, and a husband who saw her true worth. Do you want me to continue with 12? The twins' laughter, 350 words. In the same tone and flow? As the heavy silence lingered in the compound, The tension was broken by the sweet sound of children's laughter. Amira and Ayana, full of energy and innocence, slipped from their mother's side and began to run across the compound, their tiny feet pattering against the ground. They giggled loudly, their little voices ringing like bells, and in that moment, it felt as though heaven itself had sent music to drown out the bitterness of the past. The same relatives who had once mocked Chisomo for being empty now sat frozen, their eyes following the two bright girls. The twins picked up small flowers from the ground, held hands and spun in circles, laughing so hard they fell into the dust, only to rise again with even louder giggles. Their joy was pure, unshaken by the stares of those around them. To them this was just play. But to the family watching, it was a message louder than any words. The woman they had called barren now had her home filled with double laughter. Some of the younger cousins watched with wide eyes, whispering, "They are so beautiful." A few elders sighed deeply, hiding their faces, unable to bear the shame of their past cruelty. Even Chisomo's mother-in-law, who once cursed her womb, couldn't stop her tears as she watched the girls play freely, their laughter echoing through the very compound where Chisomo had once walked out in tears. Kale stood with quiet pride, smiling as he watched his daughters. Chisomo's heart swelled as she looked at them. Every giggle, every little step felt like justice. The same voices that had called her useless now had nothing to say, for the proof of her blessing was running joyfully before their eyes. Innocent and free, the twins didn't know the weight of their laughter, but everyone else in the compound felt it deeply. That sound was not just play, it was redemption, it was victory, it was the silencing of every cruel tongue. Shall I move on with 13? Confrontation of the past, 350 words. In the same emotional A. Her mother-in-law, who had once stood so tall and proud on the night she cast Chisomo out, now struggled to even lift her head. She tried to speak, but her lips trembled, and the words stumbled out, broken and weak. "Chisomo." She began, but the weight of her own shame cut her voice short. The eyes of the entire family were on her, waiting to see how she would face the very woman she had once humiliated. Chisomo didn't move quickly. She stood calmly, her daughters clinging to her dress, Kale steady by her side. Her eyes, no longer filled with tears of weakness, met her mother-in-law's with quiet strength. She didn't shout. She didn't curse. She didn't remind them of the night she was thrown out barefoot, carrying nothing but pain. Instead, her voice was steady, gentle yet powerful, like a river that could not be stopped. "The same God who saw my tears," she said slowly, her eyes never leaving the older woman's, "has turned them into joy." Those words hung in the air, sinking deep into every heart present. Her voice was not bitter. It carried no anger. It carried only truth, and that truth was heavier than any insult. Some of the relatives lowered their heads, ashamed to meet her gaze. Others wiped quiet tears, realizing how cruelly they had judged her. Her mother-in-law stood frozen, her eyes wet, her pride shattered. Chisomo didn't wait for an apology, because she no longer needed one. She had already won. Her victory wasn't in their approval but in the life she now lived, the husband who loved her, the daughters who filled her home with laughter, and the strength she carried in her spirit. In that moment the power shifted completely. The woman once called barren had become the living testimony of grace and resilience. Would you like me to continue with 14? Respect reclaimed, 350 words. In the same emotional and viral tone? The compound shifted quickly after Chisomo spoke. Relatives who had been frozen in silence suddenly began to move, rushing to cover their shame with politeness. Chairs were pulled out hurriedly. A space cleared at the center of the gathering. "Come sit here," one aunt said, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. Another cousin rushed to fan the area, while others flashed wide, nervous smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Everyone wanted to act as though they had always respected her, as though they hadn't once laughed when she was thrown out. Chisomo saw through it all. She noticed the fake smiles, the trembling hands, the desperate attempts to rewrite history. But she didn't expose them, she didn't mock them. Instead, she walked with quiet grace, each step measured, her head held high. When she sat in the seat they had scrambled to offer, it was not as the frightened woman they once humiliated. This time she sat as a woman who had reclaimed her dignity, as someone who had found power in her pain. Kale sat beside her, his presence amplifying her strength, while the twins climbed onto her lap, filling the space with laughter and innocence. Their tiny hands played with her necklace, their giggles echoing across the compound. The same compound that had once silenced her with shame now bowed to her presence. Relatives leaned in, asking questions with false excitement, praising her dress, her children, her husband. Chisomo smiled politely, but inside she knew the truth. She no longer needed their approval. She didn't need their words to define her worth. She had already proven to herself, and to the world, that she was more than what they ever believed. For the first time, she sat not as an outsider desperate to belong, but as a woman who belonged everywhere she stood. She was no longer a victim of rejection. She was a living symbol of resilience, power, and grace. Do you want me to continue with 15? The story that went viral, 350 words. To finish the scry. Word of Chisomo's return spread faster than fire through dry grass. Ndora village buzzed for days, and soon the story traveled far beyond its borders. People repeated it in markets, on buses, and in city cafes. The story of the woman once mocked as childless, who came back with twins in her arms and a billionaire husband by her side. It was more than gossip. It became a lesson. Every detail was retold with emotion. How she had been chased out in the cold night, how she had walked barefoot with nothing but her tears, and how the same family who called her useless now scrambled to give her honor. To many women, her story was like a light in the dark, reminding them that rejection does not mean the end. To the broken, it whispered that pain could be turned into power. Chisomo herself didn't boast. She lived quietly, raising Amira and Ayana with love, supporting Kale in his businesses, and helping women who had faced the same humiliation she once endured. But whether she liked it or not, she had become a living legend. Her name carried weight, her journey inspired thousands, and her dignity became her crown. The woman they had once thrown away had returned as a symbol of hope, proving to the world that sometimes rejection is not a curse. It is the doorway to glory. Would you like me to now combine all 15 parts into a single continuous 4,000-word script in one flow without headings so it reads like a complete viral story?